All right, good morning. We are in 1 Chronicles chapters 22 through 29. Since Brother Matt won't give me any more classes, we're going to have to cover about 7 today, 7 chapters, but it's going to be a good overview. 1 Chronicles chapters 22 through 29. Now, as far as this section of Chronicles is concerned, I see a contrast between this and what we studied previously in chapters 17 through 21, where God, through his providence, is preparing for the coming future temple. So if you'll recall, God gave rest to the enemies of Israel, and that was one of the necessary steps in starting the establishment of the temple. They had to have rest. And also, with the defeat of the enemies, David and his men are able to plunder, and they're able to gather all of these resources, and also they have other nations who are paying them tribute. Well, when you have all that going on, that is God's way of helping the nation to prepare for the temple. In chapters 22 through 29, you have David's preparation for the temple. So God comes first, then David comes. And David is going to prepare for the temple in the sense of he is going to appoint individuals to be singers for worship. He's going to appoint some for gatekeepers to take care of security, to take care of overseeing the temple, the treasury, the gates, things like that. You're going to have military, you're going to have priests and their duties and their responsibilities. Now, obviously, all of this is going to come from God. And we even learn that the blueprint or the template for the temple is from the hand of God. And yet the chronicler is setting up David as the one who is doing all this preparation for the temple. And what is interesting is in the book of Samuel, when we studied that, you have the author there who is putting forth Solomon as the one who is doing all of this. He's the one who's building the temple, and he's set all these things up. But when we get to Chronicles, David has been in the background this entire time doing all the prep work, where Solomon just has to come on the scene. He's given rest by God. He just comes on the scene and he just builds what his father has already prepared for him. So his father put everything together, and then Solomon assembles it and finishes what his father started. Along those lines, you have, with the chronicler focusing here on David, there's some bookends between 22 and 29. So, for example, in verses 1 through 5 of 22, it says, David said, "This is the house of Yahweh God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel." And what he's referring to is the site, the threshing floor, where he built the altar, sacrificed to stop the plague from the sinful senses. And God makes it clear this is the site of the future temple. So David said to gather the sojourners who were in the land of Israel, and he appointed stonecutters to hew out stones to build the house of God. So he's got foreign workers to help with this project as well. He prepared large quantities of iron to make the nails for the doors of the gates, for the clamps, and more bronze than could be weighed. Obviously, all that bronze is going to be for the furnishes and furniture and all that. Timbers of cedar logs beyond number. Then verse 5, David said, "My son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for Yahweh shall be highly exalted for a name and beauty throughout all lands. Therefore now I will make preparation for it." So David made ample preparations before his death. So this is a task, a project that David has prior to his death. If you remember in the book of Samuel, all of a sudden, we're tracing David and his journey, and all of a sudden he becomes weak. He becomes older. The narrator begins to kind of just wind David down as far as he's getting to the point of death. Chronicles, on the other hand, when we get to the point of David's death, all of a sudden he's got all this energy. He is preparing all of this. He's taking care of all the work necessary to help set Solomon up for success. And I think what the contrast is, because there's been a lot of contrast between these two books, even though they're very similar, is that, again, the chronicler is writing to an audience who is returning from the exile, and everything is positive. And it's in the sense of, here is the blueprint of when you come back into the land and you face this great heap of ruins, and you've got to rebuild the city, and you've got to restore worship. This is the energy that you've got to have when you come back to the land of, we are going to make these preparations, we're going to get to work, we're going to do this. And David is obviously doing this through servants and through appointed officials. It's just his name is attached to it because he is the king. But as he's coming to the end of his life, this is his goal, is God has promised me that my son will build this structure, this house, this dwelling house for his name. And so everything that David begins to do throughout these entire this section here is in response to that promise. It is him believing God. It's his faith in the unseen things. I'm not going to be there to see the completion of this temple. I'm not going to be there to see the beginnings of it. But I'm going to prepare for it as if it is coming true, because it is going to come true. And it's going to come true it's going to be established through my son Solomon. So this is his response. He's going to make the preparations before his death because he believes God. Then the other bookend of that is 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and in verse 19. 29 and verse 19. David says, give to my son Solomon a whole heart to keep your commandments. He's having a prayer here. Your testimonies and your statutes, and to do them all, and to build the temple for which I have made preparation. And then, as we continue to read in chapter 29, he is going to die. So you've got those bookends of this section, 22 through 29, is before his death, he's going to prepare, and now the preparation is done, and he dies. All right. Before I go any further, what are some things that you read, that you saw, that you thought was interesting about these chapters as a whole?
I certainly think one critical point is one you've already made, right there in chapter 28, in verse 19. All this, David said, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the works of these plans. There's also a verse a little farther up. It's verses 11 and 12. David gave Solomon the plans for the vestibule, so on and so forth. Verse 12, and the plans for all that he had by the Spirit. The LSO says in mind rather than by the Spirit, so I don't know which one is the more correct interpretation, but definitely down there in verse 19. If there's any doubt whether this was all something that David just dreamt up, or if he did this because the Lord directed him to, at least what he says to the people there is, the Lord gave him these plans.
Yeah, I think sometimes if we don't take these passages into consideration, we come away thinking, well, Solomon just built this beautiful temple. Look what, when he had this mind to be able to do all this. Well, he had this mind because of the Spirit, the pattern that was given from God to David. And there is definitely a connection to the tabernacle in Exodus. Is God gave Moses a pattern, and he followed that pattern. He did all that God commanded. And it came down to the pattern for the tabernacle, the pattern for the priests, and for their roles and their responsibilities. And all of that's happening here with the temple as well. This is not just, hey, God said, hey, I'm going to let Solomon, your son, build the temple, and however he devises this in his mind will be great. No, it is God has always given to his people the necessary tools, the mind, the pattern, whatever it is, to be able to be reconciled back to him. And that's what he's doing with this pattern of building the temple so that his people can worship him properly. Yes, sir.
I think it's a valuable lesson for us. David was a man after God's own heart. He loved God. He see that over and over. He wanted to build a house for God, and God ultimately said, no, you can't. Here's why. But that didn't stop David. That didn't suppress him. He didn't turn away. He didn't quit. He kept doing everything he could to fulfill his desire to serve his God. He wanted to build a house. He couldn't build a house, but he could do everything in his power to create a way for his son to successfully do it, and to do it to the fullest and greatest extent you can imagine. So for us, don't quit. Even though we're faced with an answer that may be not what we want to hear, doesn't mean we have to stop.
Yes, absolutely. And, going back to one of the points I made in the beginning was that David was not going to see the fruition of this, the completion of the temple, and yet he acted, like you were saying, that desire to do all these things to set up that promise to be fulfilled. Abraham was active in his faith despite receiving the promises. And I think that's a lesson for the returnees here is we have seen the promises of God play out, both in way of blessing and in curses, due to the fact that we've been in exile for the last 70 years. As we're coming back into the land, we've got to remember those blessings and those curses. If we continue to trust God despite seeing all of this play out, if we continue to trust Him, we're going to be blessed. But if we give ourselves over to sin, then we're going to be faced with those curses all over again. And it's going to be utter destruction. And it ultimately was in AD 70 when God just washed His hands of Israel because they just would not learn their lesson, and they ultimately rejected the Messiah, the Son of God. Okay. I think it's something here too that is a focus between chapters 22 through 29, just a second, Sam, is this idea of worship. That is a heavy emphasis throughout these chapters. David is really, he is bent on continuous worship, and I think the reason why is because in his mind, he sees, okay, I've got this covenant with God. It's an everlasting covenant, and he wants to maintain. He wants to do his part to maintain that. And I think he does that through worship. So you'll see as you read, there's this theme of ongoing and continuous worship. He'll set up the singers who are going to be singing morning and evening. The sacrifices, morning and evening. The gatekeepers around the clock. So all of these appointments that he's doing, all these officials, is something that is ongoing. They don't stop, and that's why they have the divisions. And that's why he's separating them, and they serve for just a couple of weeks, or depending on the division, it may be a month or so. And it's so that they're always ready for worship. They're not overwhelmed. They're not tired. There's always new people coming in on that rotation, so that the worship always continues. And I think that if you think about the purpose of the temple, that God is here dwelling with his people, man is dwelling with their God. His name is there, his presence is there, the Spirit, is going to fill the temple once the completion is done. That's where the priests are going to come in, and that's where humanity and God are going to be reconciled on the Day of Atonement, when they offer the sacrifices, things like that. So what I believe David is doing here in setting up this around-the-clock worship and all these officials and singers and how they're going to constantly be working is it shows that David wants to maintain that everlasting covenant. So again, that's part of him doing his part and instructing and setting up the nation for success so they continue to do their part in worship to God. As long as worship continues at the temple, God's presence, well, I should say as long as acceptable worship continues at the temple, and as long as they don't bring in idolatry, well, then God's presence is going to be with them. And And when you have that level of commitment where I am doing whatever it takes at the end of my life to prepare for this, and I'm setting up worship to be a continuous, ongoing, morning and evening, around the clock situation, then that shows commitment to these exiles who are coming back into the land of, okay, what is necessary for me to have restored worship with God? And David says, or the chronicler here says, read these passages, read what David did just to set up worship and then maintain it and everything that was involved in it. And that is the same energy and commitment you've got to bring to worship and to the restoration of this city and this temple so that you can be right with God once again. Sam, go ahead.
Well, one thing I see, especially there starting out in chapter 22, is David's commitment and charge to his son to be faithful to the Lord, and to follow the Lord's commands as laid out in the law of Moses. And then drop on down to verse 17, he also commands the leaders of Israel to help Solomon, not only that, but to set their heart and their soul to seek the Lord their God. Because God has given them rest, this opportunity to build, and that it's important to have that commitment to serve the Lord, which is what God had expected of his king. When he would come into power, is put God first, was to be the leader, the example, or commitment to serving God.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the message they needed to learn. And he'll repeat all this again in chapter 29 too, in chapter 28 and 29, about that wholehearted devotion of, I want Solomon to be devoted to the Lord. That's the only way he's going to be successful, bringing in a lot of that language from Moses to Joshua. And so you really see David become the new Moses in the way that he speaks to Solomon. A lot of their speeches are going to be very similar. And for the people to be successful, and specifically the king, their whole heart and soul must seek Yahweh, absolutely. So, there was another point I was going to say on that. Well, while I'm thinking about that, anyone else? Yes, sir, go ahead.
You're talking about this company that David has on duty and working around the clock. I have to admit that when I read through these passages, there's this part of me that thinks, is that much to do? Is there enough to do to occupy all these people?
That you need 4,000 gatekeepers? And,
yeah, right,
yeah.
exactly. But then, we think about types and shadows. I get to Revelation 14. Well, actually, let me back up first to Hebrews 12, where he talks about, you haven't come to the mountain that smokes, but in verse 22, you've come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. So there's that. And then you get to Revelation 4, and the picture that the Lord paints for us in his revelation to John, where it says in, talking about the four living creatures in verse 8, they each having 6 weeks, yes.
You're right.
So eyes around within, they do not rest day or night. So this round the clock singing, they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. So I think, contrary to the idea that David was engaging in some sort of self-aggrandizement, no, I think David is giving us that progressive revelation, a hint a little bit more about what's going on in that realm that we cannot see unless God reveals it to us.
Yes, absolutely. And so you've got the angels in heaven who are that uninterrupted worship. They're always worshiping. And I think that's the picture that David is trying to set up. And that's why the morning and evening definitely points to that. And it's interesting that when you get to Revelation, it's a new temple, a new Jerusalem. There's constant, continuous worship. So yeah, absolutely. On the temple in God's presence and the rest, one of the things that, if you remember, 4 or 5 lessons ago, we talked about the temple and its connections to the Garden of Eden. So in the temple you have painted on the walls, this lush garden. You've got fruit. You've got the cherubim who are in the temple, who are guarding the holy rooms, and the idea of they cannot access that tree of life. In the garden, you've got the cherubim who are guarding it. And one of the things I didn't mention, I don't think I mentioned in that, but I want to mention here, is you have this idea of rest. We cannot complete the temple until we have rest. And once the temple is completed, there is rest in the land. And I think that's another connection to Genesis, is God does his work in 7 days, and then he rested. Well, the people, they build the temple, and how many years did it take to build the temple? Remember, huh? How many? 7 years. Okay, there we go, another connection. All right, so 7 years, and then they rest, and the temple is filled with God's presence, and they're in the presence of God once again. So I think there's just a lot of connections to Eden, and then there's a lot of connections to heaven, as we're going to see when we get to the book of Revelation, that I think Stephen is teaching. Okay. On the Davidic covenant, that is another theme that's going to continuously run through this. Again, I think that, as I said, he prepares and he sets up worship because he believes in that covenant. He believes that God is going to hold up his end of the promise. But I want to break it down of how. So in chapter 17, he talks about Solomon, or David's son, is going to build a house. And so we're going to see that happen. And he's preparing for that. And that's going to specifically be done in 2 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. The promise is to establish his throne forever. And in chapters 28 through 29, you have that transition of power from David to Solomon. And so you see that promise now becoming fulfilled. And then you've got the appointment and the organization of the kingdom, because part of that promise was an everlasting dynasty, an everlasting kingdom. And so one of the things that David is doing in this prep is he's not just getting the material and the resources for the temple, for the physical temple, but he's also preparing Israel spiritually for the spiritual kingdom. And he does that with all of these officials and singers and musicians and judges and all of that, the gatekeepers, everyone that is appointed. Yes, they have a role, but that role is to maintain spiritual Israel, that they're always acceptable to God, that they're always holy. So like in the example of the gatekeepers, they are not going to allow any unauthorized individuals to come in who would defile the temple. They're not going to allow those who are not allowed to offer the sacrifices to come in and do those things. And there's, several passages about the gatekeepers. Obviously, we don't have time in this, but if you've got any questions, just see me afterwards. But there's passages in previous books that we've studied and in future books with Ezra and Nehemiah and how they're going to restore the gatekeepers and how they're going to guard the temple entrances and the treasuries and things like that. All of that, though, was to maintain holiness. So I want you to think about this. Everything that David is doing now is he wants to maintain that holiness. And I think that's one of the reasons why David ultimately, and I don't want to take this too far because I don't believe that David was unclean, but there is a sense in which, because of his bloodshed, he could not build a holy place, a holy dwelling of God. We've got all the principles or commandments and such in the book of Exodus of, if you touch a dead body, if you are in the field with a dead body or blood or whatever it is, you become unclean. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're in sin just because you touched a dead body, but you had to cleanse yourself. And there's a sense in which David, with all the bloodshed that he did, he was not in the place for him to build a holy dwelling place for God. But his son, who did not have all that bloodshed, who did not have all of that attached to him, he was given rest, he was in a position then to build that holy place. What David is doing is he's saying, okay, I want to put all of this in place here to maintain that holiness so that that's never lost. Going back to Revelation 4 with the angels, morning and evening, holy, holy, holy. That was the idea of the temple. And that should help us appreciate then when we get to the prophets and they begin to defile the temple with their idolatry and their images and their immorality. And God doesn't want them to come into the temple. And he says, just shut the gates and close them off so that no one comes in here and worships, because they are defiling that holiness and they're going against the commandments of David and what David has set up to maintain that holiness. And along those lines of maintaining that holiness and setting all these things up, I also want you to appreciate, we often talk, when we're talking about the temple, we'll say things like, man, Solomon's temple was so beautiful and it was just so glorious. And that's all true. But notice the beauty and the glory just in the prep work. I think Brad was saying a second ago about, we don't sit there and think about all this that goes into it. Do we need this many people? And yes, this is the house of God we're talking about. And the fact that the chronicler outlines all this, and he gives us a census of the priest, which is interesting contrast to chapter 21 when it's a sinful census there, I think partly due to the whole military aspect of it, whereas with the census in the following chapters, it is about the priest and worship. It's a totally different type of census. And you have the genealogy of all of these individuals as well. And you just see the beauty of the prep work. That right there, just what David does in preparing the temple should help us to appreciate just how marvelous of a house this was, and just how marvelous the spiritual household of God is as the church, us, but then also looking forward to heaven. All right, questions or comments or anything? Okay, so in breaking this down here in chapter 22, you do have the preparation that he begins. Chapters 23 through 26, you're going to have the priest's responsibility. He outlines that they're going to be offering sacrifices, so that's going to ensure the atonement and communion with God. You're going to have the general temple work. You've got all the furnishings that have to be taken care of: the table, showbread, the lampstand, the incenses, and all of this, everything that's set up, the officers, the judges, the gatekeepers, the musicians, all of that is said to bless God's name. So his name is going to dwell there, and they're doing all this so they can bless God's name. Then you also have the gatekeepers. Their role was to guard the temple entrances, the treasuries, and you had multiple treasuries. You had where you got all of the plunder from the nations paying tribute, but then also those who are paying tithes. So they're going to be watching that. The treasuries, they are there for resources for maintenance of the temple. So you had all the plunder that's going to go into building the temple, then all the tithing and such is going to help maintain the temple over the years. And then, as I said, also the gatekeeper is going to protect the temple from unauthorized persons coming in. Then you have the 24 divisions, which is a repeated thing within these chapters. Again, that is going to cause them to have this fair distribution amongst all the priests. And then also it's going to have a continuous, they're not going to be overwhelmed, they're going to continuously be being switched out. And that was for the military, that was for the service of the temple, and so on. Then you have the officers and judges, and that was for work not just within the temple, but also outside of the temple walls. So there were still things that had to go on outside the temple for the nation, and that's what the officers and the judges would do. Is they would essentially uphold the covenant, the Mosaic law and the covenant. They would uphold that. They would ensure that the nation was being obedient to God. In fact, in chapter 26, it says that their work concerned all the affairs of God and of the king. So, the king is not, even though he's there as a judge, and he is one who is going to rule with righteousness, and he's going to oversee cases and civil matters, he could not do it alone. So that's why they had the officers and the judges for outside the temple. All of that David is setting up. Now that's for the kingdom. Because, again, we're not just building a temple here, we're building a kingdom, an everlasting kingdom. We're building a dynasty, a throne that's going to be everlasting. So there's so much more that goes into his prep work than just getting some materials and some people set up for this physical building. The Levites would assist in the priests in judging these complex cases, and you can read more about that from Deuteronomy and other places as well. And what's interesting is when you look forward to Nehemiah and Ezra, as they're coming back into the land, you see that they do all these things according to the commandments of David, or to the way that David established all of these things. And so they're going to appoint gatekeepers, they're going to appoint the priests, the officers, and the judges. So part of that restoration, and that's where these returnees are reading through this. And to us, we may approach the text with, well, how does this apply to me today? Well, we can make a case that it does apply to us, but specifically to the audience, the original audience, it definitely applies to them because of the fact that they have been out of the land. They haven't had gatekeepers. They haven't had priests offering sacrifices. They haven't had officials and judges and 24 divisions and all this. They've got to restore all of that. Why? For that acceptable worship to God. That's why it's necessary. So when we get to Nehemiah and Ezra, we're going to see them pointing back to this text. So go ahead and have that as a foundation in your mind. Chapters 25, they're going to have the singers who are going to prophesy with their instruments. That again is they're singing God's word, God's message to Israel, and they're giving thanksgiving to Yahweh. In chapter 27, you're going to have the military and administration is going to be set up. Again, this is going to be on a rotation as well. You're going to have the tribal leaders, and they're going to be overseeing the tribes, ensuring that there's unity amongst the tribes there. You're going to have the counselors. I think it's interesting, too, that in 2 Samuel, we learned about some counselors who betrayed David, but the narrator there attaches to their counsel, to their advice, that it was as if it was the word of God. And so these men that David appointed, and that Solomon was going to appoint, and all the future kings were going to appoint, they were advisors to the king, to the kingdom. They spoke with wisdom. They spoke, supposed to have, to speak, with God's word and principles in mind as they're making these judgments and giving their political advice and such, because it was as if it was the word of God. I think too that it's interesting when you get to the book of Proverbs, Solomon a couple of times is going to talk about counselors and going to a multitude of counselors to receive successful advice. And I think it all points back to what his father David set up for the kingdom and for the throne. All right, so now you also have in chapter 27, the royal house is going to have stewards who are going to oversee. So they have overseers. They're going to oversee the cattle, all the animals, the donkeys and the sheep and so on. It's going to oversee the plants and the vineyards and all the produce and the products that come, the oil and the grapes and the wine and all that. All that has to be overseen. You have royal possessions and royal buildings, and so David is appointing these individuals to be supervisors over the land and over the kingdom. There's nothing left untouched. He's making sure that Solomon has a good foundation of how the kingdom is to run and how it is to operate under the reign of God. Then in chapter 28, you're going to have him give his speech, more speeches, things like that. He's going to give his task to his son, Solomon. Then you have chapter 29, again, prayer, speeches, things of that nature. I love how he consecrates the people to the Lord. You see with wholehearted devotion, they're giving willingly of their possessions. It's a free will offering. That should, in our mind, go back to the tabernacle, go back to the book of Exodus, where the people, you've got Moses who is building according to the pattern given to him by God on the mountain, but also the people are giving of their means. It's a free will offering. And so that is part of that commitment that the returnees are going to have of this is what our forefathers did. It was a free will offering, wholehearted devotion to the Lord. This is what the next generations did under Solomon, and this is what we must do now that we're back in the land if we're going to be pleasing to Yahweh.
Right.
Yes?
I think that what you're just talking about there, the contributions that people made, is just another aspect of what's already been mentioned in this class, and that is that people did whatever they could. David could not build the temple, but boy, he was going to do whatever he could.
Right.
And he went with wholehearted devotion to gather up all these materials and prepare that, and prepare the people, and to prepare Solomon himself for the building of the temple. And the people, David asked the people for contributions, and they willingly, I may not be able to be in on the building of the temple, but I'm going to do what I can here, take this contribution. So everybody just serves where they can, where they are, and does the best they can in that capacity.
Yes, and I've heard those things within the church before of, I can't preach, and I can't teach, and, I can't be in the pulpit, or, whatever it meant, Well, there are things you can do within the church that you can serve and help, and so absolutely that's a good application to us too. All right, as we come to the end here, we've got about a minute. Are there any applications you think that we can make to ourselves today from chapters 22 through 29? Besides maybe the one that whatever his name is. Not Tim. Okay. Is there any other applications that we could make to us?
The one that comes to me, going back to this idea of constant worship, and again, I think we need to be careful what we mean by that. Let's see, Romans chapter 12, I beseech you therefore brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, or I think the LSB, slightly different idea, or slightly different wording, but this idea that one is constantly aware of his standing before God, his relationship before God, and that is not something that's in the back of my list. How am I behaving? Is what I'm doing right now a glorification of God, or is it bringing me closer?
Yeah, good stuff. And it's Tony, not Tim. So, all right, thank you.